In this video, I'd really like to do two things, and the first is just to explain the purpose of comic relief in a Shakespeare play, or in other plays as well. And then the second one is to explain a fairly difficult passage in Much Ado About Nothing, Shakespeare's famous comedy, and this is the scene where the watchmen are introduced, and they talk about what their job is, what their office is. So first of all, comic relief then. When we think about the trajectory of a play, we tend to have the main plot, and then every so often we might have a subplot. Okay, so the subplot appears for a scene here or there, and the subplot is often a form of comic relief. Now, we associate the term comic relief especially with tragedies. In other words, when the action gets kind of sad, right? This is increasingly sad. Then we want some kind of comedy for a moment before we get back to the main action. And that's supposed to relieve the tension. Although later critics, certainly after Shakespeare, insisted sometimes on what are called the Three Unities. The Three Unities, and they said, well, a play, in order to be pleasing and appropriate, should follow the unities of action and time and place. And what they meant by that is that it should take place really in one location, take no more than a day, not to perform, but in terms of the time length of the play itself, or the narrative. And then the action is that there should only be one plot. You shouldn't have subplots. So later critics sometimes became a bit suspicious of the subplot and couldn't figure out, well, why do we include this in the first place? Now, I have mentioned that comic relief can be there just to relax the tension a little bit, but there are other purposes as well. And I think you see that very clearly in Much Ado About Nothing. So we have our subplot in this play, and even though it's a comedy already, the action is getting somewhat sadder. There's an accusation against Hero, one of the main characters, that she has been unfaithful to the person who's going to marry her, and that would be Claudio. And so with these accusations in the air, things are definitely getting more serious. And that's where the comic relief kind of comes in, even in what's ostensibly a comedy. Okay, so what's the purpose of comic relief or a subplot? Well, I would say that there are sort of two purposes. The one is typically just simply a practical purpose. A practical purpose. The characters in the subplot, they allow us to resolve some kind of problem. They provide some kind of solution to something that is troublesome in the main plot. And in Much Ado About Nothing, it's fairly straightforward. We have a couple of characters, Don John, who is a villain, including his henchman, Borracho, and they are trying to suggest to Claudio and the prince that Hero is cheating on Claudio. So they are the villains, and they have to be overheard and apprehended. And that's what the watchmen in the subplot do. So they overhear a confession of the kind of evil that Borracho and Don John are up to, and then they go to the governor, Leonato, and they kind of say, well, this is what's been happening. So that's the practical purpose. But with comic relief or with a subplot, there's also always a thematic purpose. And the thematic purpose is something that's sometimes hard to spot. So that's what we're going to focus on here, trying to explain what the thematic purpose is of this scene. If you look at the scene just before the comic relief scene in Much Ado About Nothing, we see that Don John is insinuating that Claudio's beloved is unfaithful. And I'll just read this scene quickly with you. So the prince says, "Why, what's the matter?" And Don John says, "I came hither to tell you," and circumstances shortened, for she has been too long a talking of, "the lady is disloyal." So notice here that he says, let's skip to the heart of the matter. Let's not beat around the bush, right? Circumstances shortened. And let's get to the point, the lady is disloyal. What you see here is a particular attitude towards language, and that's worth picking up on. The villain is always saying, let's not dwell on things, let's not take our time, let's not investigate, right? But let's cut to the chase. Cut to the chase. Okay. And Claudio says, who? Hero? Don John, even she. Leonato's hero, your hero, every man's hero. And you see here another tendency of the villain, this sort of generalization. Generalization. he's quite willing to say that all women are unfaithful. Everybody's hero is a cheat. And Claudio says, disloyal? And Don John says, the word is too good to paint out her wickedness. I could say she were worse. Think you of a worse title, and I will fit her to it. Now, this kind of habit of naming, right, of labeling, is completely backwards as to what we should be doing. If you try to describe somebody, you don't just pick a name first and then fit the person to the name, right? You try to find a name that's appropriate to the person. So this is completely backwards. Don John is saying, well, I could make up any name about her and I'll just make her fit the name. Okay, so there's a particular attitude towards language then that we see, and also a kind of attitude towards justice. Is this really a fair way to go about all of this? Now that we have a basic sense of what's happening around our comic relief scene, let's jump to the actual scene and see if we can make some sense of it now. Now, we're only going to focus on a few elements of this, so we'll move fairly quickly. Our main character here is Dogberry, and Dogberry has actually given the name to a particular phenomenon, which is what we call a Dogberryism. A Dogberryism. Also sometimes called a Malapropism. Malapropism. And what that is that you say a word, but you get the word wrong. And that's because you've actually confused two words that sound a little bit similar. One example from Dogberry is that he says he'll mix up salvation and damnation, for instance, and he doesn't seem to know the difference. So Dogberryisms and Malapropisms, these are quite funny, but they also show a kind of attitude towards language. So here again we have this focus on language, and at first we seem to see some kind of dim-witted attitude towards the world. Dogberry doesn't seem to know what he's talking about. But as we'll find out, his sayings, what he has to say, actually has a lot more truth to it, a lot more point than some of the other characters. Okay, so here are his instructions for the watchman. He says, "Why, you speak like an ancient and most quiet watchman, for I cannot see how sleeping should offend. Right? No problem if you fall asleep on the watch. Only have a care that your bills, your weapons, be not stolen. Well, you are to call at all the alehouses and bid those that are drunk get them to bed." "How if they will not?" says Seacole, one of the watchmen. "Why then, let them alone till they are sober. If they make you not then the better answer, you may say they are not the men you took them for." And what this means is that if somebody seems to be drunk, right, and they don't want to cooperate, then just leave them alone, and in the morning, if they don't respond better to you in the morning, well, maybe then you can do something about it. But clearly by that time they'll probably be sober, and so they're not drunk anymore, and as a result you really have to do nothing. It's a very convenient way to deal with drunk people. But notice again that we are dealing with naming, with labeling. The question is, what should you call these people? How should you deal with them? You can say, well, these people are drunk, right? They're a bunch of drunks. But if they don't cooperate and they say they are not drunk, what do? Just wait it out. And the idea is that identity will reveal itself in time. Identity will reveal itself. Now, if you think back to the main plot then, the main characters, who are supposed to be good characters, are not following this principle. They don't wait for a hero to be able to exonerate herself, but they cut to the chase. The scene after this, when the wedding day takes place, Claudio says, "Let's not waste any time. You are a whore, and I can't believe it, and I'm not marrying you." Right? There's nothing to it. Even Leonato, at the start of that scene, he says, "Please, friar, let's not waste too much time on elaborate wedding ceremonies. Just do the plain form. Let's get this ceremony over with, and we can jump to the celebrations." And Don John, in the very same scene, he says, "Let's not talk too much about what she actually did, the sexuality part of it, because that's not appropriate for people." Very different attitude towards language. Okay, now that's how you deal with drunk people. Well, how do you deal with thieves? Let's take a closer look. Seacole says, "If we know him to be a thief, shall we not lay hands on him?" And Dogberry says, Truly by your office you may, but I think they that touch pitch will be defiled. Right? If you touch tar, the sticky stuff that we use to make roads with, you're going to get dirty. And this is again a kind of ironic reference to the main part of the play. So what the point I'm trying to make is that every comic relief scene is a kind of ironic commentary on the main action. Here it says, the most peaceable way for you if you do take a thief is to let him show himself what he is and steal out of your company. So again, identity will reveal itself. And how do you know if somebody is a thief? Well, watch him, and if he steals away from you, right? If he sneaks away, well, he's clearly a thief. Of course, he's also gone, and you can't apprehend him anymore. But you have clearly established that he is a thief. And Virgie says, you have always been called, or been always called, a merciful man, partner. So, Dogberry seems merciful, whereas the people in the main part of the play are not merciful. They are cruel towards Hero. They don't give her a second chance. And they, again, don't wait for her to be able to reveal her true identity. Right, so let's look at one more example here. And here we read, Virgie says to the watch, if you hear a child cry in the night, you must call to the nurse and bid her still it. Second watchman, how if the nurse be asleep and will not hear us? And then Dogberry says, why then depart in peace, and let the child wake her with crying. For the ewe that will not hear her lamb when it baws, will never answer a calf when he bleats. Okay, so you have a nurse in this example, and you have a child that's crying, right? There's a relationship here. And then you have the watchmen who come by, and they are trying to interfere. And how should they interfere with this kind of, crying that's going on? Well, it's a good question. And Dogberry says, well, just leave them alone. Because what are you going to do as the watch? If the nurse doesn't listen to its own child, what will it help for you to say something about it? And the example here is that he says the nurse is like the ewe, right? The kind of mother sheep, and then the child is the lamb. So, in the same way, if a nurse doesn't listen to, or if a ewe doesn't listen to a lamb, is it likely to listen to other animals? Like, let's say, a calf, which would be the watch? No. So there's nothing you can do if you are the watch. Just go away. And the baaing here is the crying, right? If you say ba, 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 then you're a sheep. Right, so hopefully that makes a kind of sense. But how do you apply this to the main part of the play? Well, it's fairly easy, because the child is Hero. The child is crying. The child is saying, I'm innocent. The watch is those people who are in charge of justice. And what should they do? Well, they should first go to the nurse. But who's the nurse? The nurse is the parent. And that would be Leonato. And Leonato says, I wish she were dead. I don't care for Hero anymore. So what are the other people supposed to do when Leonato isn't kind? Right? And now you can see that in this comic relief scene, there's an incredible amount of astute and insightful commentary on the main part of the play, about the main part of the play. So the point then, the final point is to always read comic relief, not just for the humor, these scenes tend to be funny, but also for an interesting commentary on the main plot.